Take a look at this map. The United States military is positioning aircraft carriers, fighter jets, B-52s, and Reaper drones all over this region. And everybody is talking about why. Why Venezuela? Now, some people say it's the drug trade, and others say it's the president's ties to terrorist organizations. Others still say it's simply because Venezuela has the deepest oil reserves in the world. And quite frankly, any of those could explain the American threats of regime change. But today, we get into a different side of this story, and one that nobody is talking about. My guest today argues that the recent buildup of military in the Caribbean has nothing to do with Venezuela and everything to do with a recent defense pact signed between two of America's chief adversaries in the region, and one that puts mainland USA at direct risk of missile strikes. Venezuela, in his words, is just a smokescreen for what's really going on. Now, what's interesting about this is after we unpack what's happening in the Caribbean, we move to an exactly parallel situation unfolding right now in the South China Sea. My guest today is the renowned geopolitical analyst, Dr. George Friedman, multiple best-selling author and the founder of both Stratfor Intelligence and Geopolitical Futures. And this is The Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance so that we can better understand the world. Here's George Friedman. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
George, it's great to have you back on the podcast. I'm looking forward to this conversation today.
I am too.
Here's where I want to start. The last time I had you on, it was 2024. This was before the most recent federal election. And you were outlining your case for why it didn't matter so much who won the 2024 American election, because their place in history would likely end up being similar to a Carter or a Hoover. But who was elected in 2028 would likely be the candidate who will steward America through the next great transition. They will be the FDR or the Reagan. Now, and I think the term you used in that interview was the 2024 president will be a vanilla president, like Hoover or Carter. Somebody watching this might say, look, the American president today strikes me as anything but vanilla. So I just want to get your take on that. Does that thesis, is it still intact? Has anything changed? And any comments?
In this sense, he certainly is an extraordinary personality. By that, I don't praise it. I simply am saying he's extraordinary. On the other hand, he's doing the things that were predictable. So he's doing one fundamental thing, reducing the vulnerability of the United States to the rest of the world, both economically and militarily. Example, during the Cold War, we had enriched Europe with a free trade system, one that had not existed before, but it was essential if we were going to keep the Soviets away from the Atlantic Ocean to do that. And so we constructed an economic system, including foreign aid, that was based on Russia. Europe was strengthened because of fear of the Soviet Union. Foreign aid was given to compete with the Soviet Union. And the entire structure was created. It was clear that as the Soviet Union collapsed, and we can talk about that later, how that in Ukraine, that the U.S. had to reduce its vulnerability. Militarily, because of the Cold War, we were in constant warfare, from the Korean War through the Afghan War. Okay? They were necessary in terms of our competition with Russia. They were no longer viable. Secondly, we created an economic system which had several problems for the United States, but which we could readily absorb. And it created geopolitically what we needed: a stronger Europe, a powerful force in the Eastern Hemisphere. All these things are there. So when I look at Trump, it's vanilla in the sense that it was obviously going to happen after the Soviet Union fell. We're not going to stay in the same posture of being responsible for all the world. And in fact, I think of Trump as a hippie. You know, we want peace in the world. We don't want to be it. We're not the cops of the world and so on. So certainly he's not in a personality of vanilla form, but I thought that the 24 election would be the part where we started dismantling the system that was created 80 years ago, 1945, after World War II, in the economic side and in also the military side. And I will apologize for calling it vanilla. I didn't expect his personality. On the other hand, any president in this position would be asking the question, how much risk-taking can we do in the world? How much more military activity can we endure in the world? How much more can we shape our economic system based on free trade in order to ensure the power of our allies? And that's what's happening. So in terms of what's happening, it's to me vanilla. The way he's doing it is fairly extraordinary.
Okay, so vanilla in the sense that it was predictable. America is departing that world order that required funding and protection in Europe as a containment strategy for Russia, the Soviet Union during and immediately post Cold War. That's the vanilla part of it. This was in the cards. This world order was sustainable for only so long. I suppose on the heels of that, what happens next is to call President Trump the hippie president who wants peace, not war. And within this is a retraction from the global policing that America has executed for that same time period, 40, 50 years. Is that at odds, though, that retrenchment to like an isolationist strategy in America, is that at odds with the ongoing support in the Ukraine or the Middle East or the new developments around Venezuela? Like, are those two things counter forces, and how do you reconcile that?
Well, distinguish Venezuela from the Eastern Hemisphere.
Sure.
Because in the story, the Western Hemisphere was more important. The fact of the matter is that it really doesn't matter geopolitically. It may matter morally what happens in Ukraine. Wherever Russia's border is drawn, it's not in danger of taking all of Europe and of developing a naval force in the Atlantic, which protects us from European strikes. So from a moral standpoint, based on the morality that emerged in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, when we said, by our not being engaged in the world early on, we had this war. That's one way to look at it. But in 1945, 80 years ago, we adopted a strategy, economically and politically and militarily, that was built around the error we made in World War II, not being there soon enough. In this case, we were there from the minute it started, the period, and we also were rational in this, okay? The Soviet Union taking over Europe was a real threat, and we engaged in that. The Soviet Union dominating the Third World, the Middle East, or any other parts was a fundamental issue. So when Israel was attacked in 1973 by the Syrians and Egyptians, those armies were Russian armies, entirely created by the Russians, entirely formed by the Russians. We were, with Israel, fighting the Cold War in that dimension. We fought in various places. The meaning of these wars shift when the Soviet Union is no longer there. The question is, how do we execute a foreign policy when the Soviet dimension of geopolitics is gone? Okay? When an attack on Ukraine means something very different than an attack in Germany, stuff like that. And what you do with these moments in American history is violate the norms, because the more norms are antiquated. Now, you can do it, and I'd argued in one of my books that the federal system no longer worked, the universities no longer worked for various reasons, and these were institutions that had to be shifted. Did it have to be shifted this way? Well, there's an argument to be made. If you're going to break the thing, break it fast, break it strong. And then the next president can reconstruct it into some other form. But the point is that in terms of vanilla, if you talk about the volume of the noise, it was nothing like I expected. if you take a look at the various actions that are being taken, they were fairly predictable.
Will you interpret President Trump's trade aggression as the deconstruction of this current system? Is this us expeditiously ripping down the scaffolding for the next thing to be built? Is this contributing to that? And how do you process this trade aggression? And we can get into the trade war with China. I'd love to, but let's start with this.
80 years ago, we entered into a trading system that was unprecedented, a free trade system. Prior to that, each country kind of managed their trading system by tariffs and other things. We entered into the free trade system as an instrument for strengthening our alliances, making sure that the Europeans were there in their place primarily. That was what we were thinking about. And then the struggle, as I said, in the third world. So when you take a look at this, this is not a norm. We were in an extraordinary position for the last 80 years. So the British, when they had an empire and were responsible for it, did not have a free trade system. We created this free trade system and Bretton Woods agreements and all these other things based on a geopolitical necessity. Okay, geopolitics shifts more slowly than other things, but it finally shifted with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Therefore, the question was, why are we creating... We created a moral principle beyond a ruthless foreign policy. The moral principle was we must support our allies in all things. We must protect them. We must protect all of the world. This was a moral principle that emerged out of a fairly ruthless concept. We got to keep the Russians in a box, never let them get out. So the moral principle is deeply embedded in the last 80 years. It became a fundamental principle of economics, a moral principle that we're responsible for the things that happen. And the norm for the United States was always very different. We were different from the Eastern Hemisphere. We were safe behind the oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. And that's why people came here, to be safe from the Eastern Hemisphere. So when you talk about isolationism as kind of a immoral concept, well, the moral concept was most of us, except for the Indians, came here fleeing. You didn't come here because you were rich, wealthy, and happy back home. You came here because you were fleeing. And the oceans protected us. And the problem that occurred in 1941, when Pearl Harbor was hit, the Pacific Ocean was in danger. So we constructed, we're very good at this, a ruthless foreign policy based on a deep moral principle. Now, when that foreign policy becomes obsolete because the enemy has been contained, and it's going on for 80 years, it's hard to get away from this ideology that we have a moral obligation to engage the world. So what Trump is doing appears to be extremely immoral, and I think he could act more kindly and justly than he acts. But on the other hand, the moral principle that we are somehow responsible for the future of Ukraine costs many lives as a moral principle. So look at all the wars we fought because we had to be defender. From the Korean War onward, we had to defend. And we said it was our obligation to defend democracy. What we were really involved in is containing Russia, Soviet Union, and its allies. So if you look at it one way, it is backing off from a moral principle. If you understand that the moral principle behind this was founded in 1945, it was not the moral principle before that, and they were returning to a norm rather than leaving, destroying it, then it gets more complicated.
So if we were to look at this global policeman strategy, the key events, you could look at 1973, Israel, Syria. You could look at the 1970s war in Afghanistan. You could look at Korea, look at Vietnam. Those were all containment wars aimed at the Soviet Union. And that's the containment that's no longer necessary. If Russia's now expanding into Ukraine, that's a different thing. That's not Soviet Union ideology expanding throughout South Asia, something like this, right? So what you're saying is that era that required the American ideology of we will keep the world safe from, I guess, communism was the idea at the time. That no longer applies. That's no longer needed. That role isn't required. We can move on, right? But it's a, go ahead, please. Well, it's a practice that's ingrained in the culture and the military and the politics. And so it's hard to break the habit, even though the purpose no longer exists. Is that correct?
The habit of the United States historically was isolationist. We left the Eastern Hemisphere, came to the Western Hemisphere for peace and prosperity. It was hard to break that. It was hard. It took Pearl Harbor to break that concept. We don't have a Pearl Harbor because this is a kind of dissolution of the enemy. But at a certain point, you have to realize that we are not fighting a global war against the Soviet Union. We are not on the verge of nuclear war at any moment, that the world has fundamentally changed. So morality and foreign policy is a utility. It's something you use to justify the ruthless things you're doing. Why are we involved in Congo? Patrice Lumumba on one side, Kasavubu on the other side. Why do we care? Well, because Lumumba was backed by the Soviets. Kasavubu is our guy. With that gone, the rationality of the moral principle kind of dissolves. In other words, we then start to think more clearly about what we have at stake. During the Cold War, we had the world at stake. We had the two oceans at stake. We had everything at stake. And it was a reasonable way to proceed. Now, that was something that emerged with some difficulty from the Cold War, from the World War II, I should say. It wasn't easy to do, and there are many who oppose these things. Okay? It became the norm. Now, the geopolitical reality shifts. We're not in a global war. We'll talk about the Chinese later. We're not in a global war. Why are we posturing in this way? And it seems immoral that we leave it in the same way as it seemed immoral that we left isolationism. Remember, isolationism was a moral principle that we are not Europeans. We do not engage in these bloody wars the Europeans always have. Stay in a different position. First World War, we had to go in. Second World War, in. Both times when the Germans threatened American ships, our shipping to Europe. We had an agreement with Britain that if they surrendered to the Nazis, the Royal Navy would flee to Canada. That was part of the agreement. We wanted to protect ourselves. We turned to something different. But history moves on. 80 years is a very long time in terms of geopolitics. And that old system became obsolete. So my argument was, well before Trump, that the fall of the Soviet Union means a disengagement from the United States, both from the economic system we created in 1945, after 1945, and the military system we had, which was based basically on combating the Soviets wherever they come, either through intelligence, covert operations, or what have you. The execution of this policy always appears to be radical. It's stunning. And that's what it was when Roosevelt wanted to get into the war. So the isolation is just a stunning idea. That the one thing the United States didn't do was, in retrospect, people call this a very naive, thoughtless way of thinking of it, but it was the American imperative for a long time. And so this looks bad. It looks even worse the way that Trump is explaining it, justifying it, and everything else. But what do? Are we going to send troops to Ukraine? Is Ukraine worth all these deaths? We send them to Korea, Vietnam, every place you said. I mean, when does it stop? And this one stops fast. It's like somebody slapped you in the face.
Yeah, okay. So that's interesting. If I could try to recap what I heard you say, and you tell me if I heard it correctly. You know, for all the critics that might exist that ask, why does America need 800 military bases around the world? For a long time, 50 years, there was an answer to that question, right? And those answers materialized in the wars that we just discussed, Korea, Israel, Afghanistan, Vietnam, etc. There was an answer to that question. Why does America need to be positioned all over the world? But there's no longer an answer to that question. So now when people ask it, it's a bit muddier on the other side. But just like transitioning from an isolationist culture into a active warring nation during World War II that defended the present ideology in America, which is we don't participate in foreign wars, that's sort of the same Rubicon we're crossing today, where there's no longer an answer to that question. So some political leaders are saying we need to withdraw from being the global policeman, but that ideology is entrenched. Well, we are the global policeman. Well, who are we fighting? We don't know, but this is what we do, right? We can't not do it. We'll do it against who? It's unclear now, right? And so it's like a very similar transition just on the other side of it, right? Is that relatively accurate?
I think it's very accurate. And the basic principle is we talk about isolationism as if it was a morally degenerate concept. Okay. It was the principle of the United States since its founding. Not that we always followed it, but that was the principle. In the same way that geopolitical necessity becomes a moral principle, it seems horrible that we are not defending Ukraine.
Right.
How could we not be defending them? This is wrenching in terms of culture. And what to me was always funny is that Trump became the guy who said, let's negotiate, not make war. And the Democrats, the left and center, says, no, we can't negotiate with these monsters. So
Right.
Vietnam War, it was flipped the other way. Comes. And as I once written, I enjoyed writing it. I said, what Trump really is a hippie. He came out of the 60s, cool, hating war, wanted to make money, let's have fun. And here he is. This is the boomer generation manifesting itself fully.
That's really funny. I mean, you can kind of see it, and if you said isolationist policy is like, not palatable a few times, it seems to be like it leaves a distasteful, flavor in people's mouths. But also, whether or not people understand that term, that is sort of what got the current president, President Trump, elected, right? Was a promise to withdraw from global wars, no more war. It was, a different wrapping on the isolationist policy, displayed a different way, but that's what it was, right? And people voted for that in huge numbers, right? Now, I have to ask then, because we compartmentalized Venezuela, and right now we've got obviously military assembling around the coast of Venezuela. We've been striking fishing boats that may or may not have had narcotics on them. It's unclear. And now threatening land strikes as the next option. But sort of over and above this is very real talk about regime change. And to me, it doesn't make much sense because, I think, done a relatively deep dive into the different routes that narcotics take to make it to America. There's not fentanyl coming from Venezuela. There's very little cocaine. It's not the epicenter. If you're going to take that drug trade attack seriously, you wouldn't start there, would be my expectation or my understanding. So what's going on in Venezuela? What do you make of this? The narrative versus the reality. Why is the U.S. down there? What's the goal?
First, much more important, is we've flooded the Caribbean with massive naval force. Aircraft carriers, stuff like that. Why are we there? Let's begin with Ukraine. There was talk that we would be putting missiles into Ukraine that could reach deep into Russia. Okay? So, if we put missiles deep that could go deep into Russia, okay, what do the Russians do? They want missiles that can go deep into the United States as something to stop this. Now, about a month ago, Russia and Cuba signed an agreement, a defense agreement. The old defense agreement had lapsed when the communists fell, and they signed it. And when you look at the map and you look at Cuba, the basic issue there is not, shall we say, rockets from Cuba, although that could be. Over 50% of U.S. goods are shipped from Gulf ports, Houston, New Orleans, Galveston, what have you. That is our route to Europe, to the Eastern Hemisphere. The gap in that is the Florida Straits between Key West and Cuba, 90 miles apart. If the Russians really wanted to hurt us, and this we thought of during the Cold War a lot, the Russians would send some force blocking the Florida Straits. Okay? When they signed that agreement, which didn't really catch much attention in the press with the Cubans, I would expect back at NSA, National Security Agency, all sorts of bells went off. Because this was what we really feared from the Russians doing. If they did that, the American economy could be very badly damaged. European as well. So we flooded the Caribbean with far more force than is needed. We did not say it was because we were afraid of the Russians. Venezuela is a good excuse. But nothing we put into the Caribbean, it so overmatches anything in Venezuela, so to speak.
Right.
You don't, if you're going to stop trade of drugs and you want to hit the ships to come out, you got good intelligence, you put 4 or 5 Coast Guard frigates in place. You don't put an aircraft carrier in there. So why we're there is, one, there's a geopolitical reason. If the Russians wanted to counter an American sale of missiles to Ukraine, they could do that from Cuba if the Cubans let them. I'm not sure if the Cubans would leave them to do that, but that's the counterpoint. That's Ukraine. That's their choice in Cuba. The other point is that the Russians have been sailing ships toward Cuba for several times during this war, always seeming to go through the straits, and we wondered why. In this particular stage, we flooded it. No Russian Navy can close those straits right now. So when you take a look at the positioning of the ships, they're relatively few on the Venezuelan coast. They're a hell of a lot more closer to the Cubans.
So the Cubans. Yeah,
right.
Okay.
So Cuba is where the issue is. On the other hand, also there's another dimension to this. We hear a lot of talk of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine had 2 elements to it. One element was that the Europeans cannot intervene in the Western Hemisphere. We took it upon ourselves to say that. It also said, and we will not intervene in the Eastern Hemisphere. There are 2 dimensions to the Monroe Doctrine that everybody forgets the other one. I think in many ways, whether he's aware of it or not, and I never know what he's aware of, Trump is following the Monroe Doctrine. Disengage from Europe because we cannot win wars there that are definitive. It'll just keep going on and on. Become the dominant force in the Western Hemisphere. And remember, with the cartels, when they were formed in the 1980s, the Soviets were involved in that. They're intelligence people. There were left-wing groups in Colombia, for example, that were, I won't say organized by the Russians, but certainly supported by them with weapons and so on. And these were also close to various drug sellers, cartels. They emerged kind of together as a symbiotic thing. And the Russians did this. We saw it in Nicaragua as well. The Russians did this to destabilize the Western Hemisphere. Okay. So here we are. We have the cartels doing all these things. The Russian government, or at least Russian oligarchs, looking at the drug trade and saying, how can we get into this? Okay. And if they want to destabilize us as we've destabilized their position, it's a very nice place to start. So where do you start? Well, Venezuela has a lot of cartels. Does Maduro control the cartels? Do the cartels own Maduro? Big question. Philosophical. Don't worry about it. It's symbiotic. Similar operations in Colombia. So when you look at northern Latin America, one of the questions is, the Chinese won't do this. They're too smart to get involved in this. But this is a KGB man that's in charge of Russia. And he played that game. He's now the president, I should say, Putin. And one of the things I suspect was going on, I fairly well think it was, what if the Russians do their old 1980 trick? Come into Central and South America and start destabilizing them. The Russian excuse will be, hey, you've been supplying Ukraine. This is what we do. So the argument is, from my point of view, you're absolutely right. This is not about Venezuela because this is a crazy deployment based on that. It's not a crazy deployment if you're worried about the Florida Straits, if you're worried about a Russian agreement with Cuba, and if you're worried about the possibility of these groups that he's called terrorists, these cartels, maybe turning into those kind of groups, as we had in the 1980s. So, to some extent, the only way I can explain the deployment of the U.S. Navy, to the extent it has, it can't be about the Venezuelan drug dealers. You know, we've pulled them in a lot of stuff. All of it much closer to the Cuban coast than to Venezuela.
Okay, that's interesting. So what I learned is that the Venezuela narrative is a facade in order for the American military to add a lot of firepower to the Caribbean because of the recent renewal in the defense pact between Cuba and Russia and the potential for Russia to have missiles in Cuba that could reach deep inside the United States. And in addition to that, most military hardware that departs the United States heading for Europe comes through the Florida Strait.
Also economic. All of our trade with Europe, over 60% of our trade with the Eastern Hemisphere comes through the Florida Straits.
Right.
Into ports on this Gulf. It doesn't come into New York. Some of it does. It comes in there. You close off that seaway. Right. There's both not just a military issue here, but a deep economic one.
Right. Okay. And this goes back to where the Mississippi River spits out into the Gulf. That's why this is such an economic hot zone, so integral for America. Okay. So a couple questions on this then. First of all, that seems like a pretty reasonable explanation for why the U.S. would want troops in the Caribbean. Well, Russia's potentially arming Cuba again. We need to get in front of this. So why not lead with that? Why come up with this? Because all of this does, like, I feel like the drug story in Venezuela is so easy to poke holes in that all it does is breed distrust. We don't know what you're doing, but we do know that you're lying. If this is the real story, quite honestly, I'm like, well, yeah, that seems like a pretty realistic response and a reasonable one. So why not lead with that, do you think?
Well, because I think the reason is he doesn't want to get another Cold War with the Russians, even if we could take them or what. If he says, you're coming to Cuba, the country thinks a Cuban Missile Crisis. If we say you're going to block our ports, then it's a Russia issue. He's trying to diffuse the Russian issue. He doesn't want to get involved in another Cold War. So if you put it the way you're saying, it would be both more truthful and more counter to his basic strategy, which is to reach an understanding with Russia, open Russia up to Western investment. It's a very good place to invest. Good workers, land is cheap. It's like China was. Okay? A lot of opportunities. His idea, I think, and he said this in several ways, that he wants to have a closer relationship with Russia. He does not want to continue the Cold War. He doesn't want to pretend that the Cold War is back. Because if he says that this way, then the Russians are put in a box and they could be even more intrusive than before. So he will accept an explanation that seems to anybody looking close at it doesn't make sense. On the other hand, nobody really wants cartels shipping drugs. If he wants to say this, they tend not to analyze it that deeply. So he wanted to do this. The Russians can certainly read what we're doing. They understand what we're doing. But does he want to put the Russians in a position that they capitulate to the United States? This gives them a chance to back off without embarrassment.
So it's really a game of like plausible deniability. Is that it? Because as mentioned, the Russians clearly know if they are actually reigniting defense agreements with Cuba and planning to arm that island again, it's not lost on them that suddenly they're surrounded by the American Navy. It's not about cartels in Venezuela. They know that, right? But if the public statement to the world, America and overseas, I suppose, is all about cartels, it gives both President Trump plausible deniability in any trade conversations, and it gives President Putin, I guess, some sort of plausible deniability that we are not conceding to the Americans. That's not what this is about. It has nothing to do with that. Is that what it is?
Exactly. One further thing.
Okay.
Putin screwed up big time in Ukraine. He thought his army would, in about 2 months, occupy Ukraine.
Right.
This was the common assumption in much of the world. His military failed catastrophically, and after 4 years has only 20% of the country, at vast cost to the economy and vast cost in life. It's like the Vietnam War. We couldn't stop it because we couldn't admit how badly we decided to do it, so we kept doing it. Putin is in that position now. He's a desperate man. He'd led his country into a desperate situation. He failed militarily. He failed to shift it. He had an attempted coup d'etat by the Wagner Group. It was chaos. Putin has to be given some room to capitulate. And I think what Trump is trying to do is give him the room for an honorable disengagement, because he will not disengage without that. So if you notice, Trump has always been very polite about him, very nice about him. He's not nice about many people. And certainly none who double-cross him. There was a double-cross. He can't disengage. That's his problem. We're trying to give him room to disengage, okay? And if we throw ourselves into this as an anti-Russian, anti-Soviet, anti-Russian operation, okay, we're back in the one thing he doesn't want to be in, the Cold War.
Yeah.
No matter how weak Russia is. And secondly, he wants a peaceful end to this war. And he's trying to play this, I think, so that Putin can reach an agreement of some sorts, as bad as the situation is for him, and not make it worse. Not make it appear that the United States threatened him and had to back off. Now, I don't know that it'll work as a strategy, but when I look at everything that's going on the table, okay, and Trump's definite desire not to get involved militarily in Ukraine, not to have another one of these wars, and basically our indifference, not morally, but practically, to the outcome of Ukraine, and the fact that we want a peace agreement with Putin, targeting Russia on this makes it almost impossible for him to reach a peace agreement with the United States. How will he start a war there? Now we got the Americans in. Now he's giving in to the Americans. Doesn't work.
So, one thing that came to mind as you were walking me through that was there's maybe a trend with authoritarian leaders to double down on bad ideas.
Sure.
And maybe this is because an authoritarian leader is dependent on power and fear.
Liberal Democrats didn't double down. It's
What's that?
Only an authoritarian doubles down. In Vietnam, Kennedy went in, sending in advisors. By the 1970s, we're in the middle of a war. All these presidents, Lyndon Johnson onward, doubled down. They weren't autocrats. So this idea that autocrats are more likely to double down than liberal Democrats, which I mean not liberal Democrats, I mean liberal democracies.
Sure.
Vietnam, that was a perfect case of a liberal democracy unable to concede that it had made a huge mistake and doubling down all the way through for decades.
Okay.
Over a decade. So I don't think it has to do with authoritarian regimes. democratically elected regimes also have to convince their public that what they're doing is both morally acceptable and militarily viable. It turned out not to be militarily viable. I won't argue the morals of it.
Right.
Losing wars is not a good idea. But I'm saying that the claims that something is something different in authoritarians and how they behave is repudiated by looking at the Vietnam War.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. I mean, I was going to say that I feel like a democratically elected leader is more likely to change their stripes because they're putting themselves first, right? I will be who you want me to be. And if the tide changed from a sentiment standpoint with the public, I can be something different as long as I get to keep my job, right? Which, if you're not worried about elections, maybe you have a different take on that.
My take on presidents is that they're all power hungry and ruthless.
Sure.
They don't get to be president by being nice guys. Most hide it. They have a superb cover personality that they put out. Roosevelt was a very ruthless president. He seemed to be amiable, lovable, everything that you wanted. So political power is political power. If you gain political power by having the army backing you, you need the public backing you too. So it seems to me that when I look at democracies, telling the people, I screwed up, I'm sorry, we're leaving Vietnam,
right,
is just as hard for them. So I don't think it has much to do with it, but it's interesting. Sometimes I think in a democracy, one of the things that Trump has bought himself by being so openly ruthless, openly unpleasant, is room for maneuver. So when I used to explain why Biden was going into Ukraine, okay, the answer was, you idiot. Don't you realize that he's owned by the Ukrainians? His son and him made business in Ukraine. Don't you realize this is all it's about? The same thing's happening with Trump. Don't you realize that Trump is a maniac for power and he's only doing these things for that reason and so on and so forth? And he likes Putin because he's also a maniac for power. So whenever we look at presidents, back to Vietnam, looking at why Lyndon Johnson went into the war, Kennedy died before he had the opportunity to be blamed, okay? We always come to some conclusion about his personality. The difference in Trump is he showed his personality right off the bat. He didn't. So people say about him that he is irrational, unable to really understand what he's doing. Okay. From my point of view, he's predictable. Now, if you liked him, he's flexible. So we like presidents who are flexible, but not continually changing their minds, depending who is in power. So presidents that you like are flexible when they change their minds. Presidents you don't like are capricious. I really don't get into internal politics because whether authoritarian or democratic, the man is there because he understands the nation, that he has given the nation something. And Hitler gave something to his country. He understood the moment. Putin, to some extent, understood the moment. I don't know how he survives now, but that's another question after his mistakes. But when you think about political power is the ability to understand the moment, the mood of your country, and manage it.
Right. And because of that, and this is something that I've learned from your books, about the next 100 years, the next decade, the storm before the calm, a thesis that you restate is how inconsequential any one president is in the big picture. And we put so much weight on this, right? We got to vote left or right because this is going to change everything. When you step back, even from a 10-year view, it's rarely the case, right? And that's kind of the beauty of the American Constitution, at least it was that it was designed to limit the power of any one person. Well, I wonder if you still...
It did limit it, and it didn't limit it. Because the Constitution was a very subtle document. It outlined principles, but never explained exactly how to apply them to certain circumstances. So, for example, the Constitution says that we must have a declaration of war before we go to war. Now, assuming that we have to do something to preempt in Afghanistan, are we really going to have a congressional debate? We could do that in 1776 because we didn't have all the communications going on. You can't telegraph your need. So what we did on this was to create a new principle that if Congress simply approves of the military action, it could be done. Now, when we were fighting Cold War, many of the military actions were covert. A congressional committee was formed of trusted people, good clearances, maybe 5 or 6, who then were told what we were doing, if they were told. So the problem is that the Constitution has a principle of how we do things that in many ways, because of technology, has become impossible to do in that way. Warfare in particular is that way. We're preparing for war with Spain. Spain wouldn't find out until we showed up. Now they would. So the moral principles of the Constitution, in many ways, are absolute, and I worship them. I mean that really. On the other hand, the way it was engineered, they could not imagine what was possible, that it was not possible to hold a meeting of Congress on going to war with someone.
Right.
Either you were already at war or possibly contemplating one. So the Constitution's limits are there. Now you have to have a Supreme Court that will enforce it. And very frankly, in the area of warfare where I'm familiar, I have no idea how the Constitution could be changed or interpreted.
Okay. And I have a question on the Constitution then, and it does relate to FDR. So I kind of want to go there, but I don't want to lose the train of thought of Venezuela. There's so much, George, that I want to get after in these talks. Okay, so let's start with Venezuela. So if I understand your thesis correctly, this negates the probability of American troops actually on the ground in Venezuela, because this is a smokescreen, right? Regime change in Venezuela, that's not the agenda. That's the narrative, that's the headline, that's the excuse, that's the activity that gives everybody plausible deniability, but the goal is not that. So the probability that we execute on that is very, very low. Is that a fair assessment?
Subsidiary thing. Maduro is very close to the Russians. He was from the left. He had a close relationship. We are very concerned, as I said, about Russian covert operations in Latin America. So if you remember in the 1970s, Nicaragua and all these things, in the 1980s, this was a problem for the United States. And very bad things like Iran-Contra came out of it. So when you look at this, you can have this as a goal, one of your goals, but not necessarily your primary one. So getting rid of Maduro and destroying the cartels have honestly there's points there. One, Maduro is tied with the Russians. Number two, we don't want the Russians involved. And number three, we really do want to get rid of the cartels. One of the reasons we want to get rid of the cartels is the vast amount of money they have created, okay, goes different places. And there really is the presence of the cartels. They want, in the United States, in a sense, they want to take over the retail market as well as the wholesale market. So do not diminish the presence of it. I wouldn't go to war over it. As a side issue of getting rid of Maduro would certainly be on any reasonable agenda in the United States, as well as getting rid of cartels. But I don't think it's a primary reason.
Okay. So I think I'm with you there. And, notwithstanding, I have to think the deepest oil reserves in the world have to play some kind of a role from an incentive standpoint. But from a cartel standpoint, I get it. I think, it's an ancillary target, I guess. If you're already in the Caribbean for bigger reasons, for more important reasons, a primary agenda there is containment of the Russian-Cuban alliance. While you're there, maybe making some change in Venezuela. Maybe that's not where you would go if the primary goal was the cartels. You probably wouldn't start in Venezuela, but the primary goal is not the cartels. It's maybe an ancillary target that would chip away at Russia's power in the region as well because of those ties. Okay, I want to get to, I do have that question on the Constitution and FDR, but I'm going to save it for the end because I want to talk about China with you now. And maybe one segue we'll use. I just want to know how you're interpreting the trade war, where you see different points of leverage, how you interpret the narratives, and sticking with drugs. A question I have here, George, is fentanyl manufacturing has been a focal point of this trade war. Drugs in general, by the way, right? Initially, it was Canada was where all the fentanyl's coming from, and it's like, it isn't. And now it's Venezuela and drugs. And as you said, that's not it. But now we're talking about this trade negotiation with China and that there were some concessions made and some agreements to crack down on fentanyl manufacturing. Again, if you look into it, what I've learned is that the majority of the fentanyl manufacturing actually is smuggled out of China and occurs in Myanmar. So what's President Xi's ability to impact change there? Is this just more smoke? How do you interpret the U.S.-China power balance right now and the various levers that these two leaders are pulling on?
All wars have a misleading justification. World War II, we argued that basically we were doing this for moral reasons because we could not tolerate Hitler and stuff. It became a fundamental principle. There were other principles involved, such as national security, who controls the Atlantic. The Japanese had hit us in the Pacific, destroying our Pacific fleet. We focused initially for the first day on Japan. Germany declared war on us. We didn't declare war on Germany. I don't know how Roosevelt could have managed to, both having lost in Pearl Harbor, engage in a second war at the same time, when the second war, the war in Europe, was the one he was most interested in. He was far less concerned about the Pacific, because sooner or later we'd get the Japanese. He was terrified the fall of France would lead to the fall of Britain, which would in turn create a crisis in the Atlantic. So when he spoke about this war, he talked about the Japanese and their extraordinary viciousness in attacking Pearl Harbor. He didn't have to speak about the Germans because they declared war on us. Why? Because the Germans wanted to make sure we wouldn't get into the war in Europe. They made a deal with the Japanese that if the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor or some such thing, they, the Germans, would also attack the United States in some way, making sure that the Japanese could win in the Pacific. Mistake they made is the United States is quite capable of operating massively in both oceans. They completely underestimated it. But when you look at that, one of the luckiest things for Roosevelt was he felt that the war in Europe was much more important than the war against Japan, not in the sense that we weren't going to get them, but they weren't a priority. The priority was Europe. And when he looked at that whole thing, he reached the conclusion, thank God, the day I'm making the speech, a war that will live in infamy, the Germans, thank you, declared war on us. So wars always have on the cover, on the surface, very different intentions and perspectives of things. The Vietnam War certainly had a very different perspective of what we were doing. So when you look at wars, very rarely is there a clear-cut public display of what we're afraid of. What we were terribly afraid of is Britain capitulating, the Royal Navy falling into German hands, and then we would be in danger. We never feared the Japanese in that sense. So in each war, there's a matter of bull, next phrase, your choice, involved. And partly in order to justify what you're doing to your public, and partly to mislead your enemy into what you're intending. And the entry into World War II is a prime case of that. So when you're talking about all these baffling things that are happening, you don't enter into a conflict without baffling everybody. And when you talk about Venezuela and oil, PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, a massive oil producer in the past, now almost wrecked, is certainly an item on NSA's list.
Okay, so then, I mean, and that kind of applies to our conversation about the Caribbean and Venezuela. There's a baffling headline that is made to distract from the core goal and provide some cover. So what's the story between the U.S. and China now? Last time we spoke, and as you mentioned, actually, like the defense pact between Cuba and Russia did not get the press coverage it deserved. That's what we just said. You just said 25 minutes ago. The last time you and I spoke, you made a very similar comment about the American military build out in the Philippines. You said this is not getting the cover and people don't understand the significance of this. And I believe the reason was, as powerful a country as China is, it doesn't have access to the open ocean. And a nation without access to the open ocean is inherently limited on options. So is that the case? And maybe walk me through, therefore, the South China Sea picture a little bit for anybody that's trying to understand what I just said and why America's position in the Philippines is so significant.
Well, if you take a look at a map, there's Japan, then an opening, then there's Taiwan, then there's Philippines, there's Papua New Guinea. Each of these passageways are very small from a military standpoint. In other words, the ability of the Chinese to get out into the Pacific is limited because they're narrow waterways. This is why they're obsessed with Taiwan. They don't really want it, they don't really need it to be part of China. But they certainly need a large gap between Japan and the Philippines to get there. So this is why Taiwan is always being discussed by the Chinese. It's not sentimental value, military. And this is why the U.S. is always upset when they seem to be maneuvering around there. And this is part of why the tariffs are made. We can talk about that. But the tariffs and the military confrontation are part of the same process between the two nations. The Chinese became wealthy from exporting goods to the United States. We also became dependent on those goods because many of them were industrial components that we'd have. Our own industrial process depended on these goods. We also have a hostile relationship to China militarily. There's not a war going on, but there's constant maneuvering and all of that, and a constant fear of what the Chinese do. You can't have a nation that you're economically dependent on and intertwined with that might result in a war. Remember the Arab oil embargo of the 1970s, after the 73 war. They cut off oil supplies and almost devastated us. So how can we have an economic dependency on a country that maintains a hostile posture? There are two negotiations going on at the moment. There's one very public, between China and the United States on the economy, on tariffs. There's another more quiet one going on between the military in the United States and their representatives and the military of China to reach some sort of understanding that we have with other countries, giving 5 days notice on any exercises you're going to have, agreeing what the exercise waters are, agreeing on rules and regulations, having a hotline open so that nothing happens. So the first thing to remember about this relationship is, one, the Chinese are utterly dependent on the American market for their economy. Put it this way. China is the second largest economy in the world. It is the 69th per capita in the world. In other words, they have a vast population. China is in two parts. There's the coastal region where Americans go and go, wow, this is amazing. And there's your interior, the peasantry, which is, they say 30% of the population. I'd put it more like 50% of the population. And they live in third world poverty. When the communists came to power, it was the peasants that overthrew Chiang Kai-shek. The Chinese are very aware of unpleasantness there. If they really get hammered by the Americans, and they are getting hammered by these, and they have a crisis in real estate, which is where the Chinese park their money, not in banks, and you wind up with unemployment for the poor, you've got a lot of problems. So a few weeks ago, we saw something when Chinese social media was filled with stories that Xi had had a stroke or heart attack or was dead already.
Yeah.
He showed up. A week later, he fired 9 senior military generals, basically the Joint Chiefs of Staff of China, not the admirals, the generals, were not only forced out of office, but arrested on charges of corruption and defying the party. So there was a power struggle inside of China. We'd noticed it before, but it really came to a pitch when somebody wanted to declare Xi dead, or at least dying. Then these guys, the Joint Chiefs, were arrested. So China itself is undergoing massive problems. Given the fact that most foreigners only visit the coastal region, the really swell cities of the coast, they get a very different view of China than the reality. A lot of China is poor and they're struggling to sustain it. The tariffs that he and Trump imposed on China were the major reason for tariff wars. He didn't want to single out the Chinese and make it like they're capitulating. But it put the Chinese in a terrible position. We want 2 things from China. We want trade that's equitable. They can take advantage of us. We cannot be dependent on a country that might go to war with us. So the problem there is that, plus the fact that the Chinese have kind of reached the limits of their capabilities. The United States was once China. In the 1890s, it became a massive exporting power to Europe. And that lasted until 1930, when the Europeans could no longer absorb our things because of World War I, and we went into the Great Depression, in part because of the loss of those. The Japanese in 1950 became massive exporters. 40 years later, just like the United States, they reached 1990 and had their massive financial crisis that buried them. Mm-hmm. I have no idea why, but there have been 3 major global exporters. United States, Japan, both of which that process lasted 40 years, and China, which began about 1980 and is ending now. I don't know why 40 years, but you could only be a massive exporter for so long. In the case of both China and Japan, they did not build a domestic market that could absorb this. The Americans did ultimately, after World War II, build that market. So the Chinese are in much more trouble than most of the world sees. And that's why you're seeing internal crises, political crises inside of China. And that's why something very interesting happened last week. There was talks between Xi and Trump. Trump asked him, apparently, we want you to stop buying oil from Russia, as he did with the Indians and so on. When he left 2 days later, 2 of the largest oil companies in China announced they would not buy any more oil from Russia. This was very interesting. So who blinked first? The Chinese. The Chinese must get access to, we are 25% of the world's economy. And their entire exporting system is built on what we will buy, with the Europeans a nice added thing. And he suddenly slammed the door on them, figuring, okay, we can outlast them a lot better than they can do that, and so on. You'll note that I think that Trump is brighter than most people think. I agree that he's totally unscrupulous, as most presidents are. But I think when I see him, that I can understand why he's doing it. And I understand why the Chinese decided, after the attempted coups that we saw, to go with the Americans, not all the way, not completely cutting buying from Russia, but 2 companies. So you can see the Chinese kind of desperately trying to get a handle on the situation. And the more they try, the more difficult Trump becomes.
You know, I just want to frame some parallels here that have come up during the conversation. And the first was that in order to understand why the U.S. might be so obsessed with the Caribbean, you need to understand how reliant they are on the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, and why. And that is why we're seeing this buzz of activity, both from Russia and in response from America, to arm this region, because this critical choke point from the Gulf of Mexico / America out to the global market is what's at stake. Similarly, in order to understand, because I guess if somebody were listening to this conversation and they heard me say China doesn't have access to the global oceans, they'd be like, what are you talking about? They've got a huge coastline. But in order to understand that, you need to understand the significance of this little region around Hong Kong and up Guangzhou, which was previously Canton. This is where the British sort of were focused during the Opium Wars. And this is a key artery for China's trade. And it obviously spills out into the South China Sea, which is bordered by Taiwan, the Philippines, and et cetera. So, that's why these choke points are so important to both countries. And it's really important to recognize that all coastline is not equal. Is that a fair assessment, George? Because I know one of your key premises is geography is destiny, right? And so I've just been listening with that ear. What do you think?
It's very much the case. I mean, the Chinese access to the Pacific depends on its navy, but it also depends on the choke points, the
Right.
various choke points. And this island chain is a massive set of choke points. So, as I said before, one of the basic problems is Taiwan. That's a vast choke point, both north of it and south of it. If they take Taiwan, they have much more access to the seas. The great fear of the Chinese is that they will get out to the sea, carry out a strike, and not get home. That the access to the ports will be shut. So it's not that the United States will initiate by closing them. And these days, with drones and various other things, closing these gaps are not difficult. So those are really one of the reasons why the Chinese don't go to war with the United States or invade Taiwan, because they can't invade Taiwan. It takes about 15 hours for a landing craft to go from China's waters to Taiwan. In those 15 hours, U.S. satellites will clearly see them. U.S. missiles in Guam, not too far back, can target them completely. In other words, they don't invade Taiwan because they can't. Moreover, once the war started, they wouldn't be able to resupply. We don't have to send our Navy in to block them. We can block them with drones, missiles, and so on. So when you ask the question, if this is so important to China, why don't they just take it? They can't.
And another comment that you made here was, the U.S. can't afford for China to, I don't know, you didn't say declare war, but, we can't afford to be dependent on a country that might go to war with us, right? And that dependency might be, I imagine you're pointing to the rare earth refinement dependency right now. 97% of advanced weaponry in America is dependent on ingredients that come from China. So I interpret that as that's an absolute non-starter when it comes to any hot conflict between China and the U.S., because if I've got a gun pointed at you, you're not going to sell me the bullets, right? That's the rare earth predicament that the American military might be in. And if I look at the delay in deliveries from Lockheed Martin, consistently 2 to 5 years behind schedule, it seems, and almost always because of supply chain issues, which reading between the lines is just we can't get the magnets that we need from an adversarial nation. That's how I read that. Now, how do you interpret that leverage? Because the most of the media coverage that we see today is saying China has the U.S. cornered, right? You can't rebuild the rare earth refining capacity that they need in 5 years. It's not going to happen. And so, this is a much bigger point of leverage than people understand yet. How do you interpret that? I know there's more levers that either could pull on, but what's your take?
Well, my take, first of all, is that doesn't weaken the United States. We have a massive military already built. all sorts of capabilities. It would take at least 5 years for the Chinese to overtake us militarily, to wage war. So the issue that we would be helpless in the event of war, that has a 5-year, 10-year gap too. So I'm not sure of the number 97. It's a scary one, and it certainly will motivate many people. But rare earths are not rare. What is difficult to build are the processing systems. One of the things we learned in World War II, and we know it as well now, the one thing the United States is good at is radical industrialization, fast. If this really were that sort of problem, we would have recognized it 2-3 years ago. The Defense Department would have been screaming bloody murder, and Trump would have been using it as a major campaign issue that Biden allowed us to get into this situation of dependency. None of these things happened. So I would suggest that the level of urgency that is being stated may be overstated to give him room for maneuver if he does something against China, justifying it on that basis. But the idea that we are 97% dependent on China with no other resources would indicate that the U.S. military intelligence service and every tech company in the world would not be screaming bloody murder about this, or that the United States would be this reckless in confronting China. So it's an interesting number. I'm not sure what the number is, but when I'm watching the behavior of various parties that had to have known of this vulnerability and didn't even hint at it, that maybe it's not quite that desperate.
Yeah, I mean, could there be an angle where in the last 40 years, I mean, my entire life has been the era of free trade, as we talked about, globalization. If you had the cash or the credit, you could buy whatever you wanted from whoever had it. And so supply of these refined products, as you mentioned, rare earths are abundant in the Earth's crust. It's the processing that's the choke point. And 30 years ago, we made an agreement. We decided that we wanted this advanced technology. We wanted all the capabilities. We wanted to design the products at home so that we could control the interface and the applications. But there was a very specific part of that process that we didn't want, and that was the dirty part, right? The toxic process of refining these metals. So when China raised their hand and said, we'll take that on, we will cede environmental concessions, we'll leverage our cheap labor so you can have cheap iPhones, we signed that contract. It was a good deal. And that has been precedent for 40 years. And is it possible that this kind of snuck up on the establishment to that degree? And could that be why we weren't hearing alarm bells 5 years ago from big tech, military? What do you think about that?
The military would be screaming.
Okay.
The military would be looking at the limits. All sorts of papers would be passing through, leaking to the newspapers and all that. Okay. So that we didn't have that kind of panicking coming, especially for the tech companies. Remember, microchips require rare earths to be built. The entire foundation of tech is the microchip. It's the thing that makes it possible. It's the electricity, the internal combustion engine. It is the thing. These people are quite knowledgeable about the world. They would be knowledgeable about our lack of rare earths and that China has it by the throat. It seems to be very unlikely that the United States would have been ignorant of this fact, or that it wouldn't be taking radical steps elsewhere to build it. One of the places we were talking about was Greenland, which nobody could understand why it had rare earths. I understand that Somalia has a lot of rare earths, and many American companies have been snoozing around there. So I find it very difficult to believe that we suddenly woke up to the fact that almost all of our rare earths comes from a hostile country. And I can't believe that the U.S. military, DOD, Defense Intelligence Agency, is that crummy. No, there was something, the number may be true, but the amount of time it might take things that are already under development to substitute may be more readily available than we think. But as to be taken by surprise, I doubt that any computer manufacturer AI guy or anyone else seeing limits in the ability to build microchips and things like that would not have mentioned it. It would have been apparent. And so if this is the case, this is the most profound miscalculation that we've ever made. Worse than Vietnam, stupider.
Yeah. Okay.
And that would mean that all of the administrations before Trump led us into this. I can't believe that Trump during the campaign wouldn't have been told by someone and made a campaign issue. The idea that we all missed it. Maybe we did. I mean, I don't know. But for God's sakes, that we all missed it?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I just wonder if in the same way that 1940s American culture was complacent with isolationism, this is the best path forward until they caught a stray with Pearl Harbor. We never saw that coming. Now the game has to change. Now we have to shift how we think about our role in the world. And now we're at the other side of that, right? Where we've been the global policeman for 40, 50 years. And suddenly we're just overstretched. We're getting caught in conflicts we don't need. There isn't even an adversary that was the purpose of all this. So we need to shift. And this caught us off guard as well. And I mean, blind spots can happen, or just not even a blind spot, but just maybe an assumption that globalization is not going to end abruptly. COVID came out of nowhere. This was like the big, sniper shot in the trust in globalization that nobody saw coming. And maybe this was why this is all fell out so quickly. But without that catalyst, we might have been sleepwalking into this for another 10, 15 years. What's your take?
It's possible, but the culture inside of the military establishment, the culture inside of good tech companies is highly oriented toward what are we afraid of? Okay. And the military is more likely to find things that we shouldn't be afraid of frightening than to miss something. Even more so, the American tech companies operating in China, understanding purchasing these rare earths or the things coming from it, had to have a clear understanding. So there were many entanglements. This wasn't a far-off thing that the CIA would be looking at. When you would look at anything, you would say, by God, how can we mess with China when we have 97% of these things coming? Let's put off this tariff war for a few years. I never heard the number 97% before. Now, I've heard the idea that we're dependent. I've always was told in various ways that there are other sources and intimations of other production capabilities and so on that may not have been revealed because of environmental issues, so on. But if this were true, okay, and if this statement is right, there would be many heads flying, especially in corporate headquarters of the tech companies, and as well as in the military in DIA. And we're just too calm about it in this idea. So I think it's a very different number. I think we didn't mind the Chinese saving face by having a card to throw down that caused us to come in. But they did break their ties with Russia in a certain way for us. I find it very difficult to believe, having some insight into intelligence operations, particularly in DIA, that we would be so unaware of the vulnerability. I mean, I may be wrong, but I don't think I am.
Okay. No, and I appreciate that honesty as well. I sincerely do, because jury's out for me. But I wanted to talk to you about this because I know that you're sort of inside the circle in a few instances. So more than I am, that's for sure. I know we're bumping up against the clock here. I had one question that kind of came up as we were walking through purpose of the Constitution, how it should be interpreted, and you brought up FDR a few times. We're going to have an election in the United States in a few years, and the current president has hinted, and his team has stated, that he will run again. And if and when this happens, I could imagine the heyday that specifically liberal media will have, that this is what we all warned you about, this is the dictator coming, all this stuff. But the part that won't get mentioned nearly as often is that term limits, well, first of all, term limits by definition are somewhat anti-democratic, because if the people want to elect the same leader 3, 4, 5, 6 times, shouldn't they be allowed to? And if democracy works and that leader's no good, then vote them out. But term limits by definition, from my perspective, are actually anti-democratic and relatively new. And this is the part that I don't think will get as much press coverage, so I want to talk about it. The United States didn't have term limits. FDR was elected 4 times.
That's why they passed the term limits. Passed the term limits. They never wanted to.
He was the reason. I don't have my argument holds then, but all right, because it's the 22nd Amendment. People say, oh, it's in the Constitution. It's like, well, it wasn't. It was an amendment, and not the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th, the 22nd Amendment, right? You can amend constitutions, and we have many, many times. What's your take on the third limit concept? Will we see it? Any thoughts, George?
Well, in particular, I've heard Trump say that he didn't mean it, that he wasn't going to do it.
Well, that's smart to say.
The second thing is he's 79 years old. He's going to be 82 years old.
Yeah.
I have no idea how long he'll live or whatever.
Yeah.
Whether the country will elect an 82-year-old president, or whether, frankly, he'll be in a position to make a debate, as other elderly presidents were unable to do, I don't know. But I think that you're right, that in a democracy we should be able to make decisions. And I also think we're right that the president was the executor of the country, and all of these various federal groups should be reporting to him. The idea that we have these units of excellence, of expertise, that are not answerable to anybody because they don't want to be politically influenced, also strikes me as very much against the Constitution. How can the federal government consist of people who are not under the control of the democratically elected president, have no one there who has been Democrat, and make these decisions? So there's a counter argument when we look at the Constitution, which is the Constitution clearly stated the division of powers, which I don't think Trump truly respects. At the same time, he's saying, look, the federal government is filled with all these entities that are not answerable to me. I'm the president. There's no democratic election that appointed these people, that controls them or anything. So you look at the Fed. When did the Fed suddenly emerge where an entity of the federal government does not report to a democratically elected leader? So you can do it both ways. You look at the Constitution. The Constitution insisted that the president have control over the operation under the laws passed by Congress and also by the judgment of the courts. One of Trump's arguments, which if he were more coherent, he might be able to make, is that the federal government has evolved into a system of various entities that are not under the control of any democratically elected leader, yet make laws on what can be done. So when you look at this, if he could possibly state this way, it's really two paradoxes. One, that the Constitution itself is not being respected. Secondly, that the people who speak most for the Constitution now also wanted this to be this way. They wanted independent entities that do not answer to the president. So what this president is trying to do is gut those entities. Okay? So it runs both ways. Okay? Trump, if he could express it, has a very valid view of the presidency under the Constitution. At the same time, the way in which he engineers things seems to be unconstitutional. He does not respect the laws of Congress. So we have a double paradox, one which the media loves, that he doesn't respect the laws, but no one bringing up the question, which I did in my book, Storm Before the Calm, of all these entities that fundamentally control our lives in medicine and other areas. that reports to no one, is not administered democratically. Jefferson understood the Constitution would be chaos. He forecast that. But he put down the moral fundamentals. And the moral fundamentals are the balance of power, the rule of the people, and the president must be governing the government. And what's emerged is a presidency that does not control all the entities. And people are saying, how can he go after an entity that's not reporting to him? This is an independent entity. And he ought to be saying, yes, but it's unconstitutional. Instead, he babbles. So there is an argument made on both sides in the constitutional question. His disrespect for laws that Congress passed, at the same time, his inability to control entities that Congress created, specifically not to report to the president.
Your book was titled The Storm Before the Calm. And for anybody who wants to dive deeper into your perspective on where we stand right now in history, I strongly recommend that book, especially if you disagree with anything that George said today. But, you're a prolific writer. I have to ask, have you read The Storm Before the Storm by Mike Duncan?
No, I haven't.
It's interesting. It's a book that covers the Roman Republic during the years of 2 BC, like the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius Gracchi. And anyways, the reason that I brought it up was just because there's a lot of parallels to our current political situation that sort of covers over the period of about 100 years, 50 years, the slow breakdown of the precedent political process and the weaponization of the justice system to achieve political means. And you can read this book and find layers of parallel in today's political climate. But what's important to notice about when this book was focused was it was actually before the glory days of the Roman Empire. And any emperors that anybody has heard of, like Caesar, Aurelius, Constantine, they weren't even born when this Roman Republic was effectively breaking down, right? That was sort of the argument behind the book, was that things can look a certain way and turn very unexpectedly, I guess, is the long and the short. But The Storm Before the Calm is the book that you guys should order because it's excellent. And I've read it twice, George, 2.5 times. Read it twice, skimmed it once.
I only read it once. It's good.
Oh, I got you beat. Do you have another book in you? Can we expect another book, George?
Just finished it. It's about the geopolitics of the moon. Why we're going to the moon. Low Earth orbit has failed. It's too dangerous to be spotting wars in Ukraine on that basis. So you either disperse, you can't disperse. You either are agile in space, you can't be too agile, or you take cover. You go to the moon. That's a basic story.
Interesting. Okay. Is this on shelves?
Not yet. It's at my editor's light hand.
Yeah, all right, cool. I like that. Well, we'll look out for it. Does it have a title? Can you share that yet, or are we not there yet?
Geopolitics to end. Can I share that? No, I can't share that. I've been told by my wife.
I almost got it out of you. All right, it's fine. We'll wait. We'll be patient.
I had to turn my head. Something was waving there.
All right. Well, in the meantime, check out geopoliticalfutures.com because I'm an avid reader of this as well. You've got an amazing team of analysts. And it's a great place to start if you want to dip in daily to what matters on the geopolitical front. The Daily Memo, great place to start for anybody who's just trying to understand and make sense of the world. I appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming back on. I'll look forward to the book that is not called The Geopolitics of the Moon, but something else. And until next time, George, thank you so much.
I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much.
All right.